about all of this from Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times, who's also written about the Western resolve and the fact that the West is now in serious danger of being at the point when its resolve, if you like, has reached its peak, that it can't really be sustained at this level for very much longer. And he says this, and this is about the summit meeting, the G7 summit at Hiroshima. He says there was no hint of international pressure on Zelensky in the communique issued by the G7. This group used the familiar formula that they will back Ukraine for as long as it takes. But the unofficial message is a little more complicated. As long as it takes, but it would be better if it doesn't take too long. And then it goes on to say that the sense of urgency does not reflect any lack of sympathy for Ukraine, but there is concern that if Kiev's much anticipated counter-offensive fails to turn the tide on the battlefield, it will be difficult for the country's backers to maintain the current level of political, financial and logistical support. And then there's a long piece about Donald Trump, who in Gideon Rachman's world remains very much the villain of the piece. He's somebody who, again, Gideon Rachman appears to still believe is somehow involved or sympathetic to or friendly with the Kremlin, despite all the recent disclosures from John Durham and people like that, that the collusion allegation against Donald Trump has no reality. But then Gideon Rachman comes to the key point. He says there is the question of arms supplies. Both the United States and Europe have all but emptied their inventories of relevant munitions, such as artillery shells, in their effort to keep Ukraine supplied. Without converting to a wartime economy, Western factories cannot keep up the pace of the battle. The fighting is so intense that, as one Western politician puts it, the Ukrainians are consuming in hours what we produce in weeks. Western national security officials have had to moonlight as arms dealers, ringing around global capitals from Seoul to Islamabad to scrounge new supplies of missiles and other weapons to be sent to the front. And the article goes on to say that the US and Europeans believe that their efforts have worked and that Ukraine now does have enough weaponry to mount a serious offensive. But the West's armaments cupboard is now looking pretty bare. It will not be fully replenished by 2024, although by that time the Ukrainians will be able to deploy the fighter planes that were promised to them last week. And the point is that if the Ukrainian offensive fails, the only thing left in the cupboard is the F16s. Thereafter, there is nothing more that the West can give to Ukraine in any quantity that can affect the outcome on the battlefield. And perhaps that is the reason, more than any other, why the F-16s are being delivered. It's not because they're going to change the outcome of the battle. Even the Pentagon doesn't believe that, but because the Western powers have to continue to show their resolve, not just to Ukraine, not just to the Chinese and the Russians, but to themselves. So they don't have ammunition for the 155mm guns that they supplied to Ukraine. They don't have tanks. They can't really supply more tanks. The United States is going to get about 30 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, but these are not suitable tanks for Ukraine. They're enormously maintenance heavy. They require an enormous logistics tail. They have all kinds of, the latest variants have all kinds of sophisticated equipment and electronics and shielding, which can't be compromised by sending them into battle against the Russians. So no more tanks, perhaps a few more infantry fighting vehicles, dribs and drabs of shells. The surface-to-air missiles haven't really worked. So you've got to go on showing to Ukraine that your support for them remains undiminished, and you send F-16s, because that's all realistically you can do. And then, of course, if that doesn't work, if the F-16s fail to turn the tide of the battle, as the Pentagon itself expects, well, what do you do then? You wait, perhaps, for Donald Trump to take over in the United States, and when it all ends in a debacle, you blame it all on him. You say it's all because Donald Trump and the Republicans were putting the spokes in the wheel, preventing things moving forward, that you can go on saying that that was why this all, in the end, failed. And in the meantime, of course, you talk about frozen conflicts. At least that does seem to be the idea now, increasingly in the United States, and I suspect in Germany as well. You can't achieve victory, you can't you can't allow an outright defeat, at least not this side of the US election next year. Of course, if Donald Trump wins, well, some of your political problems are solved, but then you don't really want Donald Trump to win. So you have to find some way of ending it all, which doesn't cause a defeat. So you talk to the Russians about freezing the conflict, and you do that in all sorts of ways. And again, you tell the Russians, well, look, our resolve is undiminished. We will do whatever it takes. We will send F-16s. Because, of course, we haven't got anything else to send, but we've got to give the impression to the Russians that we are going to go on striking and fighting them all the time, forever, until eventually the Russians come to terms. Well, that might, by the way, also explain an extremely bizarre exchange which took place in the House of Commons in Britain yesterday. The former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who is no longer a Labour MP, by the way, his party chief, Keir Starmer, has pushed him out of the Parliamentary Labour Party, so he sits as an independent, but he's still there. Anyway, he asked the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, about President Luna's initiative to try to mediate an end to the conflict. And Sunak, conscious, I suspect, of the weakness now of his own position, he suffered bad defeat in local elections recently. He's got to keep the hardliners in his own party on side. He's probably worried about another possible challenge from Boris Johnson at some point in the next few months. So he got up and he said there can be no question of freezing the conflict. The war must go on. It must go on until Ukraine achieves peace, essentially on its own terms. It's extraordinary, and I found it very depressing exchange. At the start of his premiership, Rishi Sunak gave some reasons to think that he was more sceptical about the conflict than some of the other members of the British cabinet. We see how under the pressure of political events, he's now been swept along and has become every bit as hardline and, in my opinion, as misguided about this war as everyone else in Britain has been, at least in the British political class, for a long time. And we also see, by the way, and in parenthesis, another reason why Corbyn himself has become so isolated in Britain, because, of course, he's one of the few people left who, it seems to me, suggests that perhaps seeking peace might be the right way forward. And the price he has paid is, as I said, that he's no longer even an MP of the party which he led just a few years ago. Anyway, so there we go. It's all war at the moment. Send the F16s. And of course, if John Helmer is right, if this big air exercise that's been conducted in Europe is indeed a cover for some kind of sudden strike on Russia, perhaps in June, perhaps in tandem with the Ukrainian offensive, well, that would be a calamity, and that would bring us closer to World War III and nuclear war than we have ever been. I don't believe that. I hope that he's wrong, though I do think it is an issue of very serious concern. And I have to also say that, to repeat again what I said in yesterday's programme, even if that isn't the plan, if it is not the plan yet to launch some kind of big airstrike on the Russians in June, it could be eventually, it could be intended both as a signal to the Russians that when the F-16s are all shot down, that is what we will do next. We're prepared to go to the point of imposing or trying to impose a no-fly zone upon you. We know that isn't a realistic option, but we don't want you to think that, so we're going to pretend to you that that is what we might do. We're prepared, in other words, to risk World War III, because that is how this whole issue has become for us. And if that doesn't work, if the bluff is called, if the Russians continue their special military operation, as they've said they will, well, you might as well, in that case, perhaps carry out this rehearsal of this kind of air attack, because for all I know, you might eventually decide to do it. And then that would be, as I said, a crisis on a scale that we have never seen, not just since the Second World War, but arguably at any point in world history, given that nuclear weapons are in place and in existence.